Imagine the man who promised a new Roman Empire, reduced to a corpse swinging from steel beams at a Milan gas station. Why did the world cheer his brutal death? And what secrets does his downfall reveal about the dark price of absolute power? It was April 29th, 1945. In the heart of Milan, beneath the steel beams of a gas station in Piazzale Loreto, two bodies dangled upside down, riddled with bullets, faces swollen beyond recognition, spat upon by a furious crowd. One of them was Benito Mussolini, the man who once styled himself Il Duce, the father of fascism, the ruler who had promised to restore Rome's glory. Now, he hung like butchered meat, stripped of dignity, his mistress Clara Petacci swaying beside him. The cheers of vengeance echoed across the square, mingled with curses and laughter. For more than 2 decades, Mussolini had been untouchable, his image stamped on posters, his voice thundering from balconies, his black shirts enforcing terror on every street. He had marched Italy into war, aligned himself with Hitler, and bathed his nation in fire and humiliation. To millions, he was once the embodiment of authority, a man who believed history bent at his will. Yet here, at the end, he was no more than a carcass for the people's wrath. The story of Mussolini is not just the rise of a dictator, it is the anatomy of arrogance, the corruption of ideals, and the inevitable collapse of tyranny. His death was grotesque, but it was also symbolic, a mirror reflecting the rage of a country betrayed and broken. From a fiery socialist youth to a fascist demagogue, from palaces to prison cells, from Hitler's closest ally to a hunted fugitive, his journey reveals the darkest shadows of war and politics. Tonight, we unravel how a man who commanded armies, silenced dissent, and shaped the fate of Italy ended with his body swinging above a crowd that once chanted his name. This is not just the tale of Mussolini. It is the chilling reminder of how power devours its own and how history demands its price in blood. Benito Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, in the small northern Italian village of Predapio. His world was divided from the very beginning. His father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith, a fiery socialist, and an admirer of Karl Marx. His mother, Rosa, was a devout Catholic schoolteacher, stern and disciplined. In that household, the hammer of revolution clashed with the cross of faith, shaping a child torn between rebellion and order. From these contradictions, a volatile spirit was born. As a boy, Mussolini was restless, angry, and violent. He carried a knife to school, lashed out at classmates, and was expelled after stabbing another student. Yet behind this brutality lay a sharp mind. He devoured books, mastered the art of rhetoric, and discovered the thrill of commanding attention. His teachers feared him, his peers respected him, and his family saw in him a dangerous potential. When he became a young man, Mussolini channeled his rage into words. He turned to journalism, pouring venom and passion into articles that attacked the establishment and glorified revolution. In 1909, he worked as an editor for a socialist newspaper, calling for strikes and rebellion. By 1912, he had risen to prominence within the Italian Socialist Party, his fiery speeches electrifying crowds, his pen igniting unrest. He railed against war, denounced capitalism, and championed the workers. To many, he was the bright young face of Italy's radical left. But Mussolini was never truly bound by ideology. He was bound only by ambition. In 1914, when Europe slid into the abyss of the Great War, he turned his back on socialism. Once a fierce opponent of intervention, he suddenly declared that war was a path to national glory. He betrayed his comrades, was expelled from the Socialist Party, and cast adrift. Yet this betrayal did not destroy him. It transformed him. He founded his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, and began preaching a new creed: nationalism, militarism, and the cult of force. The seeds of fascism were sown not in triumph, but in this moment of treachery. Mussolini shed his old skin and re-emerged as a man consumed by a single dream: power. He would not fight for the working class. He would fight to make Italy strong, whatever the cost. The boy who once carried a knife into the schoolyard was now sharpening a blade for an entire nation. Out of betrayal came reinvention. Mussolini's pen, once dipped in socialist red, now dripped with nationalist fire. In 1919, he founded the Fasci di Combattimento, the League of Combat. It was a movement forged in the chaos of a broken Italy. Veterans of the Great War, disillusioned and angry, flocked to his banner. They were promised a new Rome, a rebirth of empire, a country forged in discipline and steel. These men wore black shirts. They carried clubs and castor oil, and they brought terror to the streets. They beat trade unionists, broke up strikes, burned down newspaper offices. Their violence was not hidden. It was theater. And the crowds watched with fear, with awe, and in some cases with approval. For a nation crippled by unemployment, inflation, and strikes, Mussolini's black shirts seemed like order in the midst of chaos. But in 1919, the fascists failed miserably at the ballot box. Not a single seat in parliament. For a moment, it seemed the dream was nothing but smoke. Yet Mussolini understood power was not only won in elections, it was seized in the streets. As Italy unraveled, he tightened his grip. By 1921, he formally created the National Fascist Party, a machine that blended paramilitary violence with political theater. He promised to crush communism, to restore stability, to defend the middle class from revolution. Fear became his greatest ally. The stage was set for his boldest gamble. In October 1922, tens of thousands of black shirts marched toward Rome. It was a spectacle of menace and bravado. The government hesitated. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearful of civil war, made a fateful decision. He invited Mussolini to form a government. What could have been a confrontation ended in surrender. At just 39 years old, Mussolini stood as Prime Minister of Italy. The march was not a battle. It was a bluff. But it worked. The boy who once stabbed classmates now stabbed democracy itself. The socialist-turned-nationalist had become Il Duce, and Italy, weary of chaos, handed him the keys to the kingdom. The rise was complete. The fall had already begun. Once in power, Mussolini moved quickly. At first, he cloaked himself in legality, presenting the image of a strong but constitutional leader. Yet behind the facade, democracy was being strangled. Newspapers were silenced. Opposition parties were infiltrated, harassed, and broken apart. By 1925, Mussolini no longer pretended. He declared himself Il Duce, the leader. Parliament became a rubber stamp. Italy was no longer a democracy. It was a dictatorship. His black shirts became enforcers of the new order. Strikes were outlawed. Dissenters were jailed, beaten, or vanished without a trace. The police and secret services answered only to him. Across Italy, portraits of Mussolini were hung in classrooms and factories, his speeches blasted from radios, his slogans painted on walls. He was not just a politician. He was a presence, a shadow looming over every Italian life. Yet Mussolini knew that propaganda alone could not sustain his rule. He launched grand public works, highways that cut through the countryside, bridges spanning rivers, vast reclamation projects that drained marshes and created farmland. These achievements dazzled some, convincing them of his vision of a modern, disciplined Italy. But beneath the surface, the economy faltered. Debt mounted. Industrial production lagged. And the illusion of prosperity relied more on pageantry than progress. The 1930s brought a new ambition: empire. Mussolini sought to restore the grandeur of Rome by conquest. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia. The war was brutal, waged with tanks, planes, and poison gas against spearmen and villagers. Civilians were massacred. Villages burned. The League of Nations condemned Italy, but no power intervened. Mussolini reveled in the triumph, parading through Rome as if he had conquered the world. Flush with arrogance, he turned towards Europe. In 1936, he embraced Adolf Hitler. The two men, intoxicated by their own cults of personality, found in each other a reflection of brutality. They sealed their alliance with the Pact of Steel in 1939, binding Italy to Germany's fate. When war erupted, Mussolini hesitated. But by June 1940, as France collapsed under German attack, he could not resist. He declared war on Britain and France, imagining easy spoils and swift glory. What followed was disaster. Italian armies stumbled in Greece, crumbled in North Africa, and bled on the Eastern Front. Soldiers were ill-equipped, morale was broken, and logistics collapsed. The myth of fascist might dissolve under the weight of defeat. Mussolini had chained Italy to Hitler's war, and the chain was dragging the nation into ruin. The once celebrated Duce was now leading his people into humiliation. His empire was crumbling before it had even been built. By 1943, the dream of empire lay in ashes. Italy was collapsing on every front. In North Africa, Rommel's retreat left Mussolini's armies broken. In the Balkans, guerrilla fighters harassed Italian divisions. On the Eastern Front, his troops froze and died beside the Germans. And then came the blow that shattered everything. The Allies landed on Italian soil. On July 9, 1943, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Sicily. Within weeks, city after city fell. The Italian people, weary of war, turned their anger on the man who had promised glory but delivered ruin. Bombs rained down on Rome. Factories stood silent. Families starved. Mussolini's grip on power weakened with every defeat. Even the king, who had once empowered him, now saw the Duce as a liability. On July 24th, the Fascist Grand Council met in secret. For the first time in more than 2 decades, Mussolini faced open rebellion from his own lieutenants. The vote was clear. He was finished. The next day, summoned to the royal palace, he expected routine business. Instead, King Victor Emmanuel dismissed him coldly. When Mussolini stepped outside, soldiers arrested him on the spot. After 21 years of iron rule, Il Duce was a prisoner. He was hidden in remote prisons, finally locked in a hotel fortress high in the Gran Sasso Mountains. Cut off from the world, his fate seemed sealed. But Hitler refused to let his ally vanish in chains. In September 1943, German commandos launched a daring raid, Operation Oak. Gliders swooped down on the mountaintop. Guards were overwhelmed without a shot fired. Within minutes, Mussolini was whisked away, flown to meet Hitler and restored as the puppet leader of a new regime, the Italian Social Republic. But this republic was a corpse. It existed only under German bayonets, in the shadow of defeat. Mussolini, once feared as a master of destiny, was now a marionette. His speeches drew little passion. His orders carried no weight. The tide of war had turned. By 1945, the Allies pushed north, while Italian partisans rose in rebellion. Cities fell. German armies retreated. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini fled Milan with Clara Petacci at his side, desperate to escape into Switzerland. Disguised in a German uniform, he joined a column of retreating troops. But there would be no escape. Near Lake Como, partisans stopped the convoy. Among them was a sharp-eyed fighter who recognized the short, sallow-faced man beneath the helmet. Mussolini did not resist. He simply lowered his eyes. The Duce of Italy had been reduced to a fugitive, caught by the very people he had once ruled through fear. The climax had arrived. The dictator who had promised to build a new Roman Empire was now a captive in his own land, awaiting the judgment not of kings or generals, but of ordinary men with rifles in their hands. Captured near Lake Como, Mussolini was taken to a farmhouse in the small village of Bonzanigo. He was no longer Il Duce. He was a weary, defeated man, silent and resigned. Alongside him was Clara Petacci, the loyal mistress who refused to leave his side. As word spread, the partisan leadership faced a decision: hand Mussolini to the Allies or execute him themselves. Debate raged. In the end, vengeance won. The order was clear: the Duce must die. On April 28, 1945, a red Alfa Romeo arrived at the farmhouse. Inside sat Walter Audicio, a partisan commander operating under the alias Colonel Valerio. Mussolini and Petacci were placed in the car, driven through winding country roads to the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. There, beside a quiet stone wall, their journey ended. At 4:10 in the afternoon, Mussolini stood expressionless. Clara clung to him, refusing to let go. No trial, no speeches, only the rattle of a submachine gun. Bullets tore through Mussolini's chest. He fell instantly. Clara screamed, threw herself forward, and was gunned down moments later. The execution was swift, but the fury of a nation could not be contained by death alone. The bodies were riddled with more bullets, pumped with lead until little remained of the once commanding figure. Their corpses were loaded onto a truck, alongside other fascist officials, and carried back toward Milan. Along the way, crowds jeered, spat, and cursed. By dawn, on April 29th, the convoy reached Piazzale Loreto, the square where fascists had once executed partisans. Now, vengeance came full circle. The bodies were dragged from the truck, thrown onto the pavement like discarded refuse. The crowd surged forward, hurling insults, striking the corpses, spitting on them, even firing more bullets into the lifeless remains. Then, in a final act of humiliation, Mussolini, Petacci, and their closest followers were hoisted upside down from an iron girder at a gas station. Their bodies swung in the morning air, blood dripping onto the concrete as thousands gathered to watch. Some cheered, some wept, some stood in stunned silence. For the people of Italy, it was both justice and spectacle, a cathartic release after years of suffering. For the world, it was a haunting image of tyranny brought low. Winston Churchill himself would later remark that execution was one thing, but the public desecration of the bodies crossed the line of civilization. Yet, in that moment, for a people who had endured bombs, starvation, and betrayal, restraint was impossible. Mussolini's reign had ended not in ceremony, not in exile, but in brutal reckoning. The man who once strode across balconies, who promised to forge a new empire, was now a corpse swaying in the shadows of his own destruction. His death was not just an ending, it was a warning etched in blood. The fall of Benito Mussolini left behind more than a corpse swinging from a steel girder. It left behind a scar on Italy and a lesson carved deep into the conscience of the world. His rise had promised greatness, discipline, and a new Roman Empire. His rule had delivered censorship, violence, and ruin. His end revealed the true cost of tyranny, not only in his death, but in the shattered lives of millions who paid the price for his ambitions. In the years that followed, Mussolini's body became a symbol of unease. After the desecration in Milan, his remains were buried in secret, Yet even in death, he could not escape turmoil. Fascist sympathizers stole the body, smuggled it across Italy, and used it as a rallying point. Only in 1957 was he finally interred in his birthplace of Predappio. To this day, that grave draws admirers of fascism, proof that the shadow of his ideology has never entirely disappeared. But history is unflinching. Mussolini's dream of empire collapsed in rubble. His alliance with Hitler dragged Italy into catastrophe. His name, once shouted in adoration, is now remembered with bitterness, shame, and anger. The boy who grew up in rebellion, who turned betrayal into power, who crowned himself Il Duce, ended as a warning. A dictator destroyed by the very people he claimed to serve. When compared with the fate of Hitler, who took his own life in a bunker, Mussolini's end was different, yet equally symbolic. Hitler's death was private, hidden from his people. Mussolini's was public, humiliating, and unforgettable. One vanished into the earth. The other was displayed as a spectacle, a brutal theater of justice. Both, however, proved the same truth. Absolute power does not endure. For Italy, Mussolini's death marked the closing of a nightmare. For the world, it remains a reminder of how fragile freedom is, how easily nations can be seduced by promises of glory, and how swiftly leaders who build their thrones on fear can be torn down. In Piazzale Loreto, where the Duce's body once swung, the city moves on. Cars pass, voices echo, life continues. Yet beneath the pavement lies a memory too powerful to fade. The day a dictator fell, and the people reclaimed their voice. Mussolini's legacy is not the empire he dreamed of. It is the warning his downfall delivers. Power without justice, ambition without mercy, authority without humanity. They all end the same way, in the shadows of war.